You want me to tear up an entire operation because a lieutenant has a feeling? 40 officers laughed with him. Somebody said the Pentagon was letting children play soldier now and did not bother to whisper it. Lieutenant Claire Donovan did not blink. She did not raise her voice. She set one thin sealed folder on the table in front of him and said 6 words. Then read this before they die. 4 days later, every laugh in that room turned to silence. Subscribe now and stay with me all the way to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Claire Donovan had been sitting in that briefing for 19 minutes, and she had already counted the people who were not going to listen to her, 22. She knew because she watched hands. It was a habit she could not switch off. Officers who intended to engage put their pens down when a briefer stood up. Officers who had already made up their minds kept writing. 22 men and women at that table kept writing straight through the operations officer's timeline for Glass Canyon, and Claire filed the number away without anger, because numbers were never personal to her and because she suspected the number would matter later. She was wrong about that. It mattered sooner. Anything else before we lock the packet? Brennan asked, already reaching for his cup. Claire stood up. Sir, Lieutenant Donovan, analysis section. I have a concern about the extraction corridor. Somebody laughed, not loudly, just enough to be heard by everyone who wanted to hear it. Brennan put the cup down without drinking from it. Analysis section. Yes, sir? Whose analysis section? Mine, sir. How many people? 2, sir. 2. He looked around the table, inviting them in. So what does a 2-person shop have that 3 intelligence divisions and 6 days of joint planning managed to miss? Claire had rehearsed her opening in the corridor for 20 minutes, and every version she rehearsed had begun with an apology. She had thrown all of them away before she walked through the door. 14 hours, sir. 14 hours. On day 2 of the operation, the withdrawal route for Team 2 runs through ground that gets reinforced on a rotation nobody plotted. Not troop counts, sir. Movement timing. I pulled satellite corridor imagery from the last 4 resupply runs and laid it against the enemy rotation schedule. The cycle repeats every 9 days. It has repeated every 9 days for the last 4 cycles without a single variation. Day 2 of Glass Canyon lands inside the reinforcement window. Our people will be moving through that ground during the 14 hours when it is at maximum density. The room got quiet. Claire recognized the quiet immediately. She had heard it before in other rooms, in other years. It was not respect. It was 40 people going still so they would not miss anything while she was taken apart. Brennan sat back. My intelligence officers walked that corridor 3 times. They walked troop counts 3 times, sir. That is a different question. Somewhere on her left, a colonel exhaled through his teeth, the sound a man makes when he watches somebody put a hand on a hot stove. Say that again, Lieutenant. Sir, you just stood up in front of 40 senior officers and told me my intelligence division asked the wrong question. Brennan's voice was almost pleasant. I want you to say it again out loud, slowly, so you understand what you are doing with your career this afternoon. And there it was, the exit. Claire felt it sitting right in front of her, clean and simple and completely available. All she had to do was say, I may have misread the overlay, sir, and sit down and go back to her converted supply room and let 412 people walk a route she already knew was rotten. Nobody would ever hold it against her. Nobody would ever even remember she had raised her hand. She thought about that for exactly as long as it took to breathe in. They asked the wrong question, sir, she said. Not the wrong corridor, the wrong question. And if I sit down now, that question stays unasked until day 2. That was when Brennan laughed. It was not a small laugh. It came up out of his chest, big and open, and it broke the tension in that room the way a starter pistol breaks a line of runners. The whole table went with him, low chuckles rolling up into open amusement. Someone repeated the word feeling in a high, soft voice and got a bigger laugh than the general had. Someone else said something about theory versus experience, and the man next to him actually slapped the table. Claire stood in the middle of it and did not move. That was the part people remembered later, the ones honest enough to remember it at all. She did not flush. She did not shift her weight from one foot to the other. She did not do the small, nervous thing people do with their hands when a room turns on them. She stood there and let it come, and when it finally thinned out, she was still standing in exactly the same way with the folder closed against her side. Do you understand what you are asking this command to do? Brennan was not laughing anymore. Delay a joint operation, reroute 2 extraction teams, rewrite 6 days of coordination across 3 units, renegotiate airframes I do not control, because a lieutenant with 19 months at this post has a hunch about terrain. It is not a hunch, sir. It is a repeating cycle. A cycle. That was Major Victor Lang near the end of the table, and he did not lower his voice at all. Right. Because nobody at Camp Halloway thought to look for cycles before 400 people signed the packet. They looked, sir, just not at that layer. Long turned all the way around in his chair to face her, and Claire understood in that moment that he had been waiting for this since the day her transfer orders had landed on this post with a classification stamp. He was not cleared to read. Let me ask you something, Lieutenant, in front of the room. Go ahead, sir. How many operations have you planned? None, sir. How many have you executed? None, sir. How many extractions have you personally run? None, sir. Long smiled. With respect, ma'am, some of us in here have actually been shot at. Claire felt it land. She felt exactly where it was meant to land, that small, precise place under the ribs. And she felt the entire room lean in to watch it land. And for half a second, something in her chest went white with a kind of anger she had not let herself feel in 3 years. I have two major, she said. I just do not bring it into briefing rooms. In a fair room, that line changes everything. Claire had seen it happen. Somebody sits back. Somebody thinks, wait. Somebody decides that maybe the numbers deserve 4 minutes of arithmetic before the laughing starts again. Lang's smile did not move by a millimeter. Convenient, he said, and the room laughed harder than the first time because Lang had just handed them permission to believe she was lying, and believing she was lying was so much cheaper than checking her math. 12 seconds. Claire counted them because counting kept her hand steady. 12 seconds is a very long time to be laughed at by 40 people who all outrank you. That is enough. Brennan raised a hand and the room shut off instantly, and Claire noted with the clinical part of her mind that never stopped working that he had not raised his hand to defend her. He had raised it because Lang had almost taken the moment away from him. Lieutenant Donovan. Sir, I have been running combat operations since before you were old enough to drive a car. I have carried men off ground that I chose myself. I have written letters to mothers. Do you know what puts a man in the position of writing those letters? Sir, somebody in a briefing room who fell in love with his own theory. His voice had dropped, and the quiet version of Brennan was far worse than the loud one. So when you stand up in front of my staff and tell me my operation is flawed, you had better bring me something better than a pattern. I brought you 4 resupply runs, a 9-day rotation, and a 14-hour overlap. Sir, Claire's voice did not change at all. If any officer in this room can show me where my timing is wrong, I will withdraw the concern right here in front of everyone and apologize for taking your afternoon. I would prefer that outcome. I would rather be wrong than right about this. Nobody spoke. Claire let the silence run. She did not fill it because she had learned a long time ago that silence does work, that argument never can. And for about 3 seconds, she felt the room actually tilt. She watched it cross faces, doubt arriving late, looking around for somewhere to sit down. A captain, 2 seats from Lang, wrote something on his pad and underlined it, and then Brennan closed the door on all of it. My answer is no, he said. We proceed as planned. Sit down, Lieutenant. Claire did not sit down. She stood there one more second, and then another, and by the 3rd second, the room began to notice, and the noticing was more uncomfortable for them than it was for her. Her folder was still closed. She let her eyes move once across the table left to right, unhurried. She was not pleading. She was not looking for an ally. She was recording. She wanted to remember precisely who had laughed, not to punish them. Claire had never once in her life wanted to punish anybody. She wanted to know in 4 days whose judgment she could trust with a human life and who she absolutely could not. And the fastest way to learn that about a person is to watch what they do when cruelty costs them nothing. 39 faces. She got all of them. One man had not laughed. Colonel Samuel Whitaker sat at the far end with his arms folded and his face closed, and when Claire reached him, he did not look away and he did not smile. He held her eyes for half a second with the flat stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head, and something in the way he was sitting told her that he had heard the phrase 9-day rotation and had understood exactly what it meant. He said nothing at all. Claire sat down. The briefing carried on around her for another 40 minutes. Fuel loads, casualty evacuation contingencies, radio windows. Claire wrote nothing because she was rerunning her own numbers, which is what she always did the moment somebody told her she was wrong. She went looking for the flaw in her own work first. She always looked there first before she looked anywhere else, and she had never once been embarrassed to find one. There was no flaw. She knew there was no flaw, and she also knew she would check it a fifth time tonight and a sixth time tomorrow anyway. And the certainty of it sat in her chest, cold and heavy, because somewhere out past that 14-hour window, there was ground that had already been prepared for people who did not know they were going to walk onto it. Dismissed. Officers filed out in clusters. Claire heard her own name twice before she reached the door, both times attached to the word lecture, and neither speaker was working very hard to keep it down. Lang caught her in the corridor. "You know what your problem is, Lieutenant. I suspect you are about to tell me, sir. You think being right is the same thing as being ready." He said it almost kindly, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. "It is not out here. You can be correct about every single number on that table and still get people killed because leadership is not about data. It is about earning the room. I did not come here to earn a room, sir. Then you will have a very short career." "Maybe." Claire stopped walking and Lang stopped too because he had not expected her to. "Can I ask you one thing, sir?" "Go ahead." "When you asked how many extractions I had personally run in front of 40 people, did you already know the answer?" Lang's jaw moved. "Because if you did," Claire said, "then you were not asking a question. You were staging one. And a man who stages questions during operational planning is not somebody I would ever want checking my timing on a day when it actually mattered." She left him standing in the corridor. She made it all the way to the far end of the hallway before the mask came off, and it came off for exactly 3 seconds. Her jaw locked. Her free hand closed into a fist against her thigh hard enough that her nails left 4 small marks in her palm that she would still be able to find that night. 3 seconds. Then she breathed out and opened her hand and put her face back on. The humiliation was not the part that mattered. It had never been the part that mattered. The part that mattered was whether the people in that room survived being wrong. That bad. Sergeant Nina Alvarez was waiting at the corner with a tablet under one arm, and one look at Claire's face told her everything she needed to know. "They are proceeding as planned." "Did you show them the rotation?" "I showed them all of it. And the general asked the room to laugh at me," Claire said, "and the room obliged." Alvarez stopped dead. "All of them." 39. "You counted them." "I count everything, Nina. You know that about me." They walked. Alvarez said nothing for about 20 steps, and Claire could feel her winding up the way she always did before she said something she had been holding for weeks. "You could tell them." Alvarez's voice was low, and she checked over her shoulder first. "One phone call, one name. Ma'am, this whole thing is over in 10 minutes, and Team 2 goes home." "No." "Claire." "No. They laughed at you." Alvarez's voice cracked on the word, and Claire realized with something close to embarrassment that her sergeant was angrier about this than she was. 40 people, over a 9-day cycle that a competent junior analyst could verify in 1 hour if anybody could be bothered. And you would rather let 400 people walk a bad route than pick up a phone. That is not what I said. Then say what you mean, ma'am, because from where I am standing, it looks like pride. Claire stopped and turned to face her, and for the first time all day, something raw came through in her voice. "The second I use that name, I stop being an officer with an assessment," she said. "I become a name, and people either fear a name or they resent it, and either way, nobody ever looks at my data again. They react to me instead. They approve my rotes because they are afraid of me. And then one day I am actually wrong about something, Nina, because I will be everybody is and nobody checks, because nobody checks the person with the file." Alvarez looked at her. "Somebody stopped checking your work once," she said. "That is what this is." Claire did not answer. "Ma'am, not today." Alvarez, to her credit, let it go, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. The office was barely an office. 2 desks, 3 monitors, a mapping program that stalled every time it tried to render elevation. Claire set the folder down, opened it for the first time since the briefing, and spread the quarter overlays across the desk with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. She had just reached for the rotation chart when Alvarez said, "Ma'am, before you check that a fifth time." "What?" "I pulled something while you were in there." Alvarez set the tablet down and turned the screen toward her. "You need to look at this first." "What is it?" "An access log." Claire looked at it. She looked at it for 8 full seconds without saying a word, and Alvarez watched whatever calm she had carried out of that briefing room thin down into something much harder and much colder. "When did this come through?" 40 minutes ago, right about the time they were laughing at you. It was the most boring document in the world. A routine system record. Nobody at Camp Halloway had ever read one of these unless they were hunting for something specific. Claire was always hunting for something specific. Somebody had pulled the complete satellite corridor package, the same 4 resupply runs, the same 9-day window, every single file she had lived inside for the last 4 days. At 2:14 in the morning, 11 hours before she stood up in that room and said any of it out loud. Nina, who was on shift at that hour with that clearance. That is the part. Alvarez's voice had gone flat. Nobody, ma'am, I checked the roster twice before I brought this to you. Raw satellite feed at that level is not inside standard clearance for this post-intelligence division at all. It is not a permission somebody here has and used badly. It is a permission nobody at Halloway is supposed to have. Then how did they pull it? They routed it, 3 separate terminals in sequence, so the request reads as if it originated outside the network. Alvarez swallowed. You do not do that by accident, ma'am. You do not do that because you are curious. That is 4 extra steps taken for one reason only, which is to make sure that if anybody ever looks, the trail walks away from this post instead of toward it. Claire stood very still with her hand flat on the corridor map. She had walked into that room this morning believing she was having an argument about terrain. A stubborn general, decades of instinct, a junior officer with inconvenient arithmetic. Frustrating and ordinary and survivable. Somebody had read her data before she read it out loud. Somebody had known exactly what she was going to find 11 hours before she found the words for it and had taken 4 deliberate steps to guarantee that nobody could ever walk it back to them. Lock it, Claire said. Already locked. Do not send it anywhere, not to Whitaker, not to the security office, nowhere. Ma'am, if somebody inside this post pulled classified feed at 2 in the morning, the security office is exactly what exists for that. And if the person who pulled it is somebody the security office answers to. Alvarez did not have anything to say to that. Pull everything on that credential, Claire said. Every login, every file touched, every minute that account was live. And Nina, do it slowly, ordinary queries only, nothing that raises a flag anywhere. That is going to take days. Then we do not sleep. Claire looked back down at the map at the 14-hour window she had drawn in her own handwriting 3 nights ago, and for the first time since the laughing started, she felt something colder than humiliation move through her. They did not miss it, she said. Ma'am, nobody missed my pattern, Nina. Somebody buried it. They did not sleep. Alvarez ran ordinary queries for 6 hours straight, the kind that would look like a board sergeant cleaning up file permissions, and Claire checked the rotation cycle a 5th time and a 6th time and found exactly what she had found before, which was nothing wrong with it at all. At 7:30, the office door opened without a knock. Colonel, Claire straightened chin. Her first instinct was to close the folder on the desk, and she made herself leave it open because hiding her work from the only man in that room who had not laughed was not going to help anybody. Samuel Whitaker shut the door behind him. Not fast, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants a conversation to stay inside 4 walls. 26 years, he said. I have sat through more briefings than I can count. I have never seen a room turn on somebody that fast. With respect, sir, I am not sure why you are here. Because most people flinch. Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. That is the whole reason. When a room laughs, something moves in the face. Every time. Yours did not move, Lieutenant, and in my experience, people who can hold that still have usually been somewhere that makes a briefing room feel very small. Claire said nothing. I am not going to ask what is in your file. He glanced at the corner of a page under the maps at a classification header. She had not shown anybody in that room. That is not my business, and I doubt I am cleared for it. I came to tell you that not everybody in there believed what they were laughing at. Then why did nobody say so, sir? It came out sharper than she intended, and she regretted it immediately. And Whitaker did not react with offense at all. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting it. Because Walter Brennan has run this command for 11 years with no operational failure, he said. Not one. Every man at that table has a career built on top of that record. Questioning him in public is not questioning a route. It is questioning 11 years of trust that a lot of people have mortgaged their futures against. That does not make it right. No, it makes it complicated, and complicated is worse because complicated is survivable for everybody except you. Whitaker crossed his arms. I read enough after action reports to recognize a clean pattern. When somebody lays one out, Lieutenant, you laid one out. The problem is not whether you are correct. The problem is convincing a man who already decided the conversation was finished. Then what do I do, sir? You stop bringing him a pattern. Whitaker's voice dropped. Men like Brennan do not change their minds because somebody is right. They change their minds when the cost of staying wrong becomes worse than the cost of admitting it. You need proof he cannot walk out of. And Lieutenant, I would move fast. Glass Canyon launches in 144 hours, and whatever window you are worried about is not going to wait for the chain of command to catch up. He put his hand on the door and paused. That log on your sergeant's screen, he said. I cannot read it from here, and I do not want to. But if it is what your face says it is, do not take it through official channels. Why not, sir? Because official channels have people in them. And he was gone. Alvarez waited until his footsteps faded. He knows something. He suspects something. That is different. Claire sat back down. But he is the first person on this post who looked at me and saw something worth trusting instead of something worth laughing at, so let us not waste it. It was 10 past 11 that night when Alvarez said her name in a voice that had all the exhaustion burned out of it. Ma'am, come look. Claire crossed the room in 3 steps. The 3-terminal routing, Alvarez said. It was built to read as external. It does, perfectly. But underneath all of it, there has to be an authentication key at the bottom of the stack, because something has to actually talk to the server, and whoever set this up got sloppy about exactly one thing. The key does not resolve to an outside node. Where does it resolve? Alvarez turned the screen. Communications Division, Building 4. This post. Claire did not say anything for a long moment. That is not an intrusion, Alvarez said. That is somebody who eats in our mess hall. By 6 the next morning, they had a name, and the name made no sense at all. Sergeant Toby Nolan. Alvarez read it off the personnel record twice like it might change. 6 years in, clean file. No disciplinary flags, no financial flags on his last screening, no security incidents. Ma'am, he is nobody. He is a guy who fixes the radio in the motor pool on his own time. That is exactly the kind of person you use. You think he did it on purpose. I think his credentials touch files he had no reason to touch at 2 in the morning through 4 steps designed to hide it. Claire rubbed her eyes. Everything past that is a guess until we ask him. Ma'am, we cannot haul a sergeant into an interrogation room over an access log. If we are wrong, or if this gets back to Brennan as an unauthorized investigation on his post. I was in that room yesterday, Nina. I know exactly what happens if we are wrong. They found him in the communications building an hour later, and Claire knew before she said a single word. His shoulders went rigid the second he registered who was standing in the doorway. Not the startled look of an innocent man interrupted, the look of somebody who had been waiting a very long time for a specific knock. Sergeant Nolan, do you have a few minutes? Pretty tied up right now, ma'am. He did not look up. His hands had stopped moving on the keyboard entirely, and Claire could see that he had forgotten what he was typing. It will not take long. With respect, Lieutenant, I have got a cue. Sergeant, Claire kept her voice level and almost gentle. This is not official. Not yet. I would rather it stayed that way for both of us. But I need 5 minutes, and I need them now. He looked up. What Claire saw in his face was not defiance. It was raw, undisguised fear, the kind that lives under the surface of a man who has not slept properly in 3 weeks. And something in her chest went tight because she had walked into that room prepared to find a traitor, and instead she had found a scared man who was relieved to finally be caught. He followed them into the equipment room at the end of the hall without another word. I know about the 214 access, Claire said the moment the door shut. No preamble. Men like Nolan broke faster under directness, and the gentleness could come afterward. Satellite courier, files routed through 3 terminals to read as external. Your credentials were at the bottom of it. I do not. He stopped. The lie died in his throat before it finished forming. Sergeant, I am not here to end your career. I am here because in 6 days, 412 people are going to walk into a corridor that somebody wanted mapped in advance. And I think you know something about why. I did not want to do it. It came out fast and cracked apart the second it left him, and Alvarez took an instinctive step back to give him room to fall apart without anybody crowding him. Tell me. 3 weeks ago, somebody approached me off post. Nolan pressed his shaking hands flat against his thighs like he could force them sterile by will alone. Civilian clothes, said he worked logistics for a contractor on our resupply chain, said he needed access to routine satellite feed for a coordination report. That was all he told me, and you believed him. I did not have a reason not to. His voice went thin. Lieutenant, I have got a sister. 2 years ago, she got mixed up with some bad people. Gambling debt, the kind that does not go away because you ask politely. I have been sending money every month to keep collectors off her door, and I have been doing it so long I stopped noticing it was happening. He looked up. This guy knew about that. He knew the exact number, ma'am, to the dollar. He said if I did him one small favor, the debt disappears, and 3 days later, it was gone. All of it. Gone. Claire felt something cold settle deeper than it had before. That was not corruption. Corruption is a man choosing money. This was leverage applied with precision by somebody who had known exactly which single sentence would make Toby Nolan compliant without ever having to threaten him out loud. Did he give you a name? No name. Nolan hesitated, and Claire watched him decide in real time whether the rest of it made things better or worse for him. He had a ring, academy ring. My brother went to a service academy, so I noticed it, but the crest was wrong. It was not one of the big four. What did it look like? Silver and dark red, deep red almost brown, and a bird on it, not an eagle, sharper, like a falcon. Alvarez was already typing. There is one more thing. Nolan's jaw worked for a second. He said somebody on post pointed him at me. Somebody who already knew about my sister before he ever showed up at my apartment. The room went very quiet. Somebody on post, Claire repeated. That is what he said. Did he say who? No, and I did not ask. I was scared enough already. Nolan dragged a hand down his face, and something almost like relief crept into his voice. The exhausted relief of a man who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. I have hated myself every day since. I keep thinking about what that data actually gets used for. I keep thinking about who walks into something because of me. You are going to help me fix it, Claire said, and it was not a question. Anything, whatever you need. For now, you say nothing. You go back to your station and you act exactly the way you have been acting for 3 weeks, and you do not mention this conversation to anybody. Not your chief, not a friend, nobody. She waited until he met her eyes, because if the man who approached you finds out we are looking before we are ready, he buries every thread that connects him to this. And he may do worse than that to make sure you cannot talk. Nolan nodded too fast. Out in the corridor, Alvarez turned her tablet around and her face had gone the color of paper. Ravenscroft Academy, she said. Silver and dark red, falcon crest, small school, about 140 graduates a year, and ma'am, here is the part. It does not feed the regular officer pipeline. It feeds private defense contracting. Better than half their alumni go straight to firms. Cross-reference the firms against Holloway's logistics support. Working on it. Claire's radio crackled before Alvarez finished the sentence. Lieutenant Donovan, report to General Brennan's office immediately. Alvarez's head came up. That is not good. No, Claire said. It is not. Lang was already standing by the window with his arms crossed when she walked in, and Claire understood immediately that this conversation had been staged before she arrived. Close the door. Brennan did not look up from his paperwork. I received an interesting report this morning. It seems somebody in my command has been pulling personnel records without authorization. Welfare files, financial disclosures, contact logs, all of it routed through a certain two-person analysis shop. Claire kept her face completely still, and her mind moved very fast. Somebody had flagged Alvarez's queries. Ordinary queries, slow, careful, deliberately unremarkable queries. And somebody had noticed them anyway and taken them directly to the commanding general, instead of through any normal channel, which meant somebody had been watching the system for exactly that search pattern, and had been ready to move the moment it started. Sir, if I may. You may not yet. Brennan's voice was flat and controlled, which was worse than the contempt. I laughed at your assessment yesterday. I will admit that. I did not authorize you to run an unofficial investigation into my people using access that sits well outside your clearance and your assignment. Sir, I have reason to believe the corridor compromise was not an accident. I believe somebody on this post deliberately. Do you have proof? Claire hesitated. 3 seconds. That is all it was. She had a frightened sergeant's confession, a description of a class ring, and an authentication key pointing at Building 4. And none of it would survive a formal challenge, and she knew it, and Brennan knew she knew it. Not yet, sir. I am building toward it. You are building toward accusing an officer in my command of sabotage on a hunch. Brennan set his pen down. Same way you built toward accusing my intelligence division of incompetence yesterday. Do you see a pattern, Lieutenant, or should I spell it out? Over by the window, Lang allowed himself the smallest possible suggestion of a smile, and Claire felt something in her chest go cold and tight at the sight of it. If this continues, Brennan said, I refer the matter to the Inspector General, not to protect whoever you think you are chasing, to protect this command from a junior officer who has decided to turn a disagreement into a hunt. And there it was again. The instinct rose in her so hard, she felt it in her hands, the urge to put the sealed folder on his desk right then and let 41 hours in the Sarrett Valley speak for itself, to watch his face change when he understood exactly who he was threatening with an Inspector General referral. She crushed it the way she always did. I understand, sir. Do you? I understand that you want it stopped. I want it done properly, through the appropriate office, by people with the authority. File a formal report today if you believe there is a compromise. A formal report takes days to process, sir. Glass Canyon launches in 5. Then write quickly. She was 3 corridors away before the full weight of it landed. Less than an hour. That was all it had taken for somebody to see 2 ordinary personnel queries and put a report on the commanding general's desk. And there was only one kind of person who watches a system that closely. Alvarez was already tense when she got back. They know. They know. How? Somebody had a report to Brennan before we finished walking out of the comms building. Claire closed the door out of pure instinct, aware that it made no practical difference if the systems themselves were being watched. No more official queries. Every search we run is a flare that tells them precisely what we know. Then how do we build anything? Quietly, without fingerprints. Ma'am, Alvarez's voice had changed. Lang was standing right there while Brennan took you apart. Hay was. You think it is him. I think he is arrogant and dismissive, and has made it very clear he does not respect me. Claire chose the words carefully. None of that makes him a traitor. Plenty of officers are exactly that and never betray anybody. But I do want to know where Major Victor Lang was 3 weeks ago. The travel authorization turned up by 5 that afternoon. Lang had gone off post the same week Nolan was approached, destination listed as a family visit, 2 hours out, entirely routine, except that the request had been submitted and approved less than 6 hours before departure. That is thin, Alvarez admitted. It is a thread. At 7:10, Wistaker walked in again without knocking and closed the door before either of them could react. You two are drawing attention. We are aware, sir. I do not think you are. His voice carried an urgency that had not been there before. I was in Brennan's office an hour ago on an unrelated matter. Lang was in there ahead of me, and I heard part of a conversation neither of them meant for anybody to hear. He told the general, and I am quoting as closely as I can manage, that the lieutenant's little investigation needs to be shut down before it embarrasses this command in front of people who matter. Claire went very still. People who matter. That was the phrase. Could be nothing. Could be Lang worrying about optics in front of higher command. Whitaker shook his head. Except I have known Victor Lang for 4 years, and I have never once heard him use language like that. He does not care about embarrassment. He cares about being right. Unless he is protecting something specific, unless that. Whitaker put a plain, unmarked folder on the desk between them. I cannot help you officially, and if anybody asks, I never gave you this. I pulled Halloway's logistics support contracts for the last 18 months. There is a company in there you need to look at. Kestrel Line Continuum. Alvarez made a small sound. You have got it already? Whitaker said. Ma'am, that is the Ravenscroft match. It came up 40 minutes ago. Over half their senior staff. Silver and dark red, Whitaker said. Falcon. I thought that might mean something to you. He tapped the folder. There is more. Their resupply contract with this post renews in 6 weeks, and the renewal terms include an expanded scope. Full logistics oversight for extraction and rescue operations. Not resupply, extraction. Claire heard her own voice come out very quietly. A scope expansion like that needs justification. It does. The kind of justification that comes from an existing operation demonstrating a capability gap. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. If Glass Canyon fails, Claire said slowly, if 2 extraction teams walk into something and it goes wrong, that is not a tragedy. That is a business case. A much bigger contract, Alvarez said. And they need somebody inside this command with enough influence to make sure the operation proceeds through exactly that corridor, no matter what anybody puts in front of the general. Claire looked up. Sir, I need you to be honest with me. Do you have anything on Lang beyond a badly timed travel request in one overheard sentence? Nothing, Whitaker said, which is exactly why I am telling you not to turn what I just said into a conclusion. He could be precisely what he appears to be. Understood. There is one more thing. Something in his tone made both women go still. I checked the operational overlay before I came here. Somebody filed a minor route adjustment for Team 2 this afternoon. Small. Technically inside standard planning parameters. It would not raise a single flag on its own. What does it do? It moves their secondary rally point 2 kilometers deeper into the corridor you flagged. Claire felt the floor shift. Who filed it? It came through Major Lang's office, Whitaker said. Logged as routine operational refinement. Signed approved and already folded into tomorrow morning's briefing packet. He left, and Claire stood looking at the map she had drawn 3 nights ago with the danger zone now 2 kilometers wider than it had been that morning. Ma'am, Alvarez's hands were not steady. That is not a future risk anymore. Somebody made that corridor worse today, in daylight, while we were standing here. I know. We cannot file a report. Brennan told you that road ends with an inspector general referral against you. We cannot go through Lang. Whitaker cannot help without burning himself. Alvarez's voice rose. So what is left? We go around all of them. Claire picked up her phone and scrolled to a number she had not dialed in more than a year, and her thumb hovered over it for one long second. The line rang twice. This is Colonel Prescott. Ma'am, it is Claire Donovan. She closed her eyes. I need help, and I need it fast. I think a contractor is manipulating an active operation to engineer its failure, and I think I have about 96 hours before 412 people walk into it. The pause on the other end went on long enough that Claire wondered if the call had dropped. Then Prescott's voice came back and every trace of sleep was gone out of it. Start at the beginning, Lieutenant. Do not leave anything out. He said it out loud 11 days later, and Claire was not ready for it. Brennan called a full staff assembly, which he had done exactly 4 times in 11 years, and Claire assumed it was about the operation review until she walked in and saw that every single officer who had been at that table on Tuesday was in the room, and so was every officer who had not been, and Alvarez was standing along the back wall, and Whitaker was standing next to her. Sit down, Lieutenant. She sat. 19 days ago, Brennan said, a lieutenant stood in a briefing room in this building and told 40 senior officers that our extraction corridor for Glass Canyon was compromised. She was correct. She was correct in every particular, and she had the arithmetic to prove it, and she offered to withdraw her concern on the spot if anybody in the room could find a flaw in her timing. Nobody moved. I laughed at her. Brennan let that sit. I want you to hear that from me, and not from a rumor in the mess hall. I laughed first, which gave 38 of you permission to laugh second, and then a man in this room asked her how many extractions she had personally run in front of her peers, knowing the answer. Claire did not look at Lang. She heard him shift in his chair. 412 people came home from Glass Canyon, Brennan said. They came home because after we laughed at her, she went back to a converted supply closet and kept working. Not out of spite, not to prove anything to me. She kept working because the corridor was still bad on Wednesday, whether anybody believed her or not. He looked out across the room. I have spent 31 years believing that leadership means commanding a room's attention. I want every officer in here to understand what I actually learned in 4 days from a lieutenant with 19 months at this post. Sometimes leadership means holding the truth alone in a room that refuses to hear it for as long as it takes for the room to catch up. He paused. And gentlemen, the room does not always catch up. That is the part that should keep you awake. Afterward, in the corridor, an officer Claire had never spoken to stopped her. I laughed, he said, that Tuesday. I want to say I was one of the ones who did not, but I was. And I have a daughter at a service academy right now, and I have thought about it every night since. Claire looked at him for a moment. Then check somebody's math this week, she said. That is the only thing that fixes it, not apologizing to me, checking somebody's math. The consequences arrived over the next 4 months, and they arrived heavier than anybody at Camp Halloway expected. Damian Kroll had spent 11 years telling people he had relationships that could make problems stop existing. And it turned out he had been telling the truth about the relationships and lying about what they could survive. Contract fraud, a lot of men in his position walk away from with a settlement and a non-disclosure. Kidnapping a United States Army sergeant and threatening federal officers on a recorded line was a different category entirely. And every single one of those relationships discovered simultaneously that they had never really known Damian Kroll all that well. Ethan Brasher cooperated completely, and his testimony did more damage to Kestrel line continuum than anything Mercer had assembled. He gave up the whole architecture. 2 other posts, 4 other officers on other bases who had been identified, profiled, and approached exactly the way Nolan had been, though only one of them had said yes. Brasher's sentence was reduced. His career was finished forever, and by the end of his testimony, he seemed almost grateful for that. Victor Lang was formally reprimanded for signing operational documents he had not read, and it did not end his career. And Claire was privately relieved about that, though she never said so to him. What she did hear from Alvarez from somebody at another post, and then from an officer she did not even know, was that Lang had started opening every training session he ran with the same story. Not the story about the corridor, the story about line 11 of a routine filing he had signed while thinking about lunch. He tells it badly, Alvarez said. He tells it like a man confessing, but he tells it every single time. Good, Claire said. You are not going to gloat even a little. Nina, he pulled every filing in his office and read all of it and brought me 3 more. At 2 in the morning. Nobody made him do that. Claire shrugged. He was arrogant. He was never a coward. Those are different diseases. Toby Nolan healed physically inside a month. The rest took longer, and Claire made a point of going to see him, not out of obligation, but because she understood the specific weight of a decision made under a pressure nobody else would ever be asked to carry. I keep thinking I should have told somebody the same day he came up to me, Nolan said, the very first day, before any of it. Probably. He looked up surprised. You asked me to be honest, Sergeant. Yes, probably. That would have been better. Claire leaned back. And I understand exactly why you did not, because a man told you your sister's debt could disappear and you were tired, and it had been 2 years and nobody had ever offered you a single way out before. You were protecting somebody you love. That is not weakness. The failure does not belong to you. Feels like it does. It will for a while, maybe a long while. Claire's voice went quieter. But the failure belongs entirely to the man who built a system designed to find people who love somebody. He did not corrupt you, Toby. He went looking for a man with a sister because that is a supply chain to him. And if it had not been you, it would have been somebody else with a mother or a kid or a mortgage. Do you understand the difference? Some nights. Some nights is where it starts. I was quiet, and then he said the thing she had not seen coming. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you sat down across from me in that equipment room, you already knew. You had the credential, you had the routing, you had all of it. He looked at her. You could have brought that to the security office and had me arrested by lunch and been the officer who caught the leak. It would have made you look right in front of everybody who laughed at you. Why did you talk to me instead? Claire thought about it for a while because she wanted to answer it honestly and not well. Because when I walked into your building, I was 90% sure you had sold us out and 10% sure you had been used, she said. And I have lived on the wrong side of a 10% before, Sergeant. 3 men are dead because I acted on a model I was 90% confident in. So I do not get to skip the 10% anymore. Not ever. Not for anybody. Nolan looked at the floor for a long moment. That is the difference between you and him, he said. Kroll never checked the 10% either. He just never lost anything for it. Not until this time. But Colonel Diane Prescott called her personally in the spring. I read your full file yesterday, she said. Start to finish the way I should have done 3 years ago instead of signing the classification and moving on to the next thing. Ma'am, I want to tell you something and I want you to not deflect it, which I understand is going to be difficult for you. Prescott's voice had a warmth Claire had not heard from her before. I have served 21 years. I know maybe 6 officers I would trust to hold together the way you held together in Surat, and I know 2 I would trust to do what you did at Camp Halloway, which was arguably harder because there was no adrenaline and no clear enemy, and it took 4 days and everybody in the building thought you were a joke. There were other people, ma'am. There were. Every one of them moved because you moved first. Prescott paused. And Claire about the 3 men. I want to say one thing about it, and then I will never bring it up again unless you do. Claire waited. You have spent 3 years asking yourself whether you were brave or just certain, Prescott said. I have read the after action, the imagery, the timeline, and the transcript of the stand-down order. Here is my professional judgment as the officer who signed your classification. You were both. You were brave and you were certain, and you were also wrong about 1 position out of 9. And those 3 things are all true at the same time, and you have been trying for 3 years to make them collapse into one clean verdict about your character. Her voice steadied. They do not collapse. That is not a flaw in you. That is what it actually costs to make decisions with incomplete information, and every officer who ever mattered has paid it. Claire did not say anything for a moment because she could not. There is a practical piece, too, Prescott said, letting her have the silence. The department is rebuilding how contractors get vetted for expanded operational access. The whole framework, Camp Halloway, is the case file the review is built on. Whatever happens in your career from here, Lieutenant, understand that this went considerably further than 1 corridor. Her transfer orders came through in June. A joint operations planning division and Prescott's recommendation attached, and a role built specifically around the kind of work that had gotten her laughed out of a briefing room. Brennan stood up when she came in to sign out, which he had not done any of the other times. Sir, I asked to see your file after the operation, he said. You authorized the release. I want you to know I read all of it, and then I read it a second time, and there is a sentence in there I have not been able to put down. Which one, sir? The recovery cell's justification for the stand-down order. Brennan's mouth tightened. An analyst does not get to convert a projection into an operation. Yes, sir. That is a good rule, Lieutenant. That is a rule I would have written myself and enforced, probably harshly. He looked at her. And on Tuesday, I applied that exact rule to you in front of 40 people without knowing I was doing it. And I was wrong both times, and I have been trying to work out how a rule can be right in general and catastrophic in particular. I do not have an answer for that, sir. I have thought about it for 3 years. I have one. Brennan came around the desk. The rule is fine. What is broken is that we apply it to the person instead of the work. Nobody in that recovery cell looked at your model. Nobody in my briefing room looked at your timing. In both cases, the rule got used as a reason not to look, and a rule that lets a man skip the looking is not a rule anymore. It is a hiding place. Claire felt something in her chest give slightly. There is one more thing, Brennan's voice changed. I have recommended you for commendation, not for the operation and not for Kroll. I recommended you for what happened between Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning when 40 people had just laughed at you and nobody was watching and there was no possible reward for continuing, and you went back to a supply closet and checked the rotation cycle a 5th time. Sir, that is just the job. Donovan, he said it almost gently. That is the only part of this whole story that is actually rare. Everything else you did a dozen good officers could have done. Going back to work after that room with nobody watching for people who would never know your name. I have met maybe 3 people in 31 years who would have done that. He put out his hand. Young officers ask about you now. Every new class, they ask what it looked like when you stood in that briefing room and refused to back down. What do you tell them, sir? The truth. Brennan almost smiled. I tell them you did not argue. You did not raise your voice. You did not have a dramatic line, and you did not slam anything on the table. You just kept doing the work until the work got louder than the laughing, and it took 4 days, and it very nearly took too long. The send-off was smaller than the story that eventually circulated about her. No ceremony. A handshake from Brennan, a hard-fast, unguarded hug from Alvarez, that neither of them had expected to need as much as they did. You are going to be insufferable in a joint command, Alvarez said into her shoulder. Probably. Ma'am, Alvarez pulled back and her eyes were wet, and she was furious about it. Thank you for not making that phone call. The name one, I was wrong in the hallway, and I have wanted to say it for 4 months. You were not wrong to ask. I was wrong about why you would not do it. I thought it was pride. Alvarez shook her head. It was not pride. You were protecting the only thing that actually works, which is people checking each other's arithmetic, and you were willing to be humiliated to keep it working. I did not understand that for a long time. Nolan came to see her off too. He stood straighter than he had in the weeks after the warehouse. I put in for a transfer, he said. Personnel recovery, analysis side. Claire looked at him. I want to be the guy who notices the quiet person in the room, Nolan said. Instead of the guy everybody stops noticing. That is the whole reason they picked me, ma'am. Nobody looks at the guy who fixes radios. You already are that guy. I am not sure that is true. You told the truth to an officer who could have ended you when lying was easier and safer, and nobody would ever have known, Claire said. That is what noticing costs. You already paid it once. Months later at her new posting, Claire stood in front of a room of junior officers for the first time as an instructor, and the room looked exactly the way she had known it would look. Some curious, some skeptical, 2 or 3 already glancing at the modest rank on her collar and doing the same arithmetic that 40 people at Camp Halloway had done in half a second. She did not open with the corridor. She did not open with the warehouse or with Kroll, or with the fact that a general who had laughed at her now told her story to every new class that came through his command. She did not mention the sealed file at all, and she never would, and the ones who eventually heard about it heard it from somebody else. She started the way she had always started. Everybody put your pens down, she said. Not because I am about to say something important, because I am going to be able to see who is listening, and I want you to know that I can see it, and I want you to think about what that means about the last briefing you sat through. A few pens came down slowly, then more. Now open the data set on page 1, Claire said. There is a mistake in it. I put it there. It is not a hard mistake, and it is not hidden. Any one of you can find it in about 6 minutes if you actually look. She let it sit. 6 minutes is the entire lesson. Somebody will stand up in a room in front of you one day with a number you do not want to hear, and it will be inconvenient, and they will probably be junior to you, and you will have 6 minutes and a choice. By the end of the session, the skepticism in that room had turned into something else. The same grudging earned respect she had spent an entire career, building one careful conclusion at a time without ever once raising her voice to demand it. And back at Camp Halloway, Walter Brennan still told the story to every new class of officers who passed through his command. Not as a story about rank or about a classified past or about the dramatic moment a folder hit a desk. He told it as a story about the unglamorous discipline of doing careful work in a world that rewards volume over truth. And every single time he ended it the same way. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the one worth trusting. The quiet officer holding the folder nobody bothered to open may be the only person present who already knows exactly how the story ends. And real strength, the kind that brings 412 people home and changes the mind of a man who spent 11 years never being wrong, has never once needed anybody's permission to be believed. He said it out loud 11 days later, and Claire was not ready for it. Brennan called a full staff assembly. He had done that 4 times in 11 years, and every one of the previous 4 had followed a death. So the room came in quiet and stayed quiet. Claire assumed it was the operation review until she looked around and understood the arithmetic of who was present. Every officer who had been at that table on Tuesday, every officer who had not been. Alvarez along the back wall out of place and clearly under orders to be there. Whitaker standing beside her with his arms folded. Sit down, Lieutenant. She sat. 19 days ago, a lieutenant stood in a briefing room in this building and told 40 senior officers that our extraction corridor was compromised, Brennan said. She was correct in every particular. She had the arithmetic to prove it, and she offered on the record to withdraw her concern on the spot if any officer present could find one flaw in her timing. Nobody moved. Nobody looked for the flaw. I want to be precise about that because it is the only part of this that matters. Brennan's voice did not rise at all. It was not a hard check. Any competent analyst in this command could have run her rotation cycle in under an hour. Nobody ran it, not one of us. Instead, I laughed, and because I laughed, first 38 of you were permitted to laugh second. Claire felt the room's attention move on to her and made herself stay still. And then an officer in this room asked her in front of her peers how many extractions she had personally run. Brennan let that sit. Knowing the answer, she did not look at Lang. She heard his chair shift anyway. 412 people came home from Glass Canyon, Brennan said. They came home because, after that room laughed at her, she walked back to a converted supply room and checked her work a fifth time. Not out of spite, not to prove anything to me. She kept working because the corridor was still bad on Wednesday, whether anybody believed her or not, and she is apparently the only person in this command who understood that a fact does not care how a briefing goes. He looked out across the room. I have spent 31 years believing leadership means commanding a room's attention. I learned something else in 4 days from a lieutenant with 19 months at this post. Sometimes it means holding the truth alone in a room that will not hear it for as long as it takes for the room to catch up. He paused. And gentlemen, the room does not always catch up in time. 19 days ago, we came within about 30 hours of finding that out. Afterward, in the corridor, an officer Claire had never spoken to stopped her. I laughed, he said, that Tuesday. I have been telling myself for 2 weeks that I was one of the ones who did not, and I was. I was in the third row and I laughed. He swallowed. I have a daughter at a service academy right now. Claire looked at him for a second. Then check somebody's math this week, she said. Somebody junior. That is the only thing that actually fixes it, not apologizing to me. The consequences arrived over 4 months, and they arrived heavier than anyone at Camp Halloway had expected. Damian Kroll had spent 11 years telling people he had relationships that could make problems stop existing, and it turned out he had been telling the truth about the relationships and lying about what they could absorb. Contract fraud is survivable at his level. Men in his position settle it, sign something, and reappear 2 years later at a different firm. Kidnapping a United States Army sergeant and threatening federal officers on a line that was being recorded was a different category entirely. And every one of those 11 years of relationships discovered simultaneously that they had never really known Damian Kroll all that well. Brasher cooperated completely, and his testimony did more damage to Kestrel Line Continuum than anything Mercer had assembled on his own. He gave up the whole architecture. 2 other posts, 4 other soldiers on other bases who had been identified, profiled, and approached in exactly the way Nolan had been. 3 of them had said no. Claire read that line 4 times when Mercer sent it to her. 3 men had been offered the same impossible thing Nolan had been offered, and 3 of them had walked away, and not one of the 3 had reported it, because reporting it meant explaining why somebody thought they were viable in the first place. That is the part that should terrify people, Mercer said on the phone. Not that Nolan said yes, that 3 men said no and stayed silent, and Kroll got 4 attempts for free. I was always going to get somebody. He was, and nobody would ever have known how many times he tried. Victor Lang was formally reprimanded for signing operational documents he had not read. It did not end his career, and Claire was privately relieved about that, and she never told him so. What she did hear first from Alvarez and later from an officer at another post who did not know she was connected to any of it was that Lang had started opening every training session he ran with the same story. Not the corridor, not the arrest. Line 11 of a routine filing he had signed while thinking about where he was going for lunch. He tells it badly, Alvarez reported, like a man confessing in church. It is genuinely uncomfortable to sit through. Good. You are not going to enjoy this even slightly. Nina, he sat in his office from 2 in the morning until 7, reading 5 weeks of paperwork, line by line, and he found 3 more, and he brought them to me in front of a general and said out loud that he was both the man who laughed and the man who signed. Claire shrugged. Nobody made him do that. He was arrogant. He was never a coward. Those are different diseases, and only one of them is fatal. Toby Nolan healed physically inside a month. The rest took longer, and Claire went to see him, not out of obligation, but because she understood the exact weight of a decision made under a pressure nobody else would ever be asked to carry. I keep thinking I should have told somebody the same day he came up to me, Nolan said. Day one, before any of it. Probably. He looked up startled. You asked me to be honest, Sergeant. Yes, probably that would have been better. Claire sat back. And I understand completely why you did not, because a stranger told you your sister's debt could disappear and you were tired, and it had been 2 years, and in 2 years, nobody had ever offered you a single way out of anything. That is not a defense. It is not supposed to be. It is an explanation, and they are different, and you are allowed to have one. Her voice dropped. The failure does not belong to you, Toby. It belongs entirely to the man who built a system designed to go looking for people who love somebody. He did not corrupt you. He shopped for you. If it had not been your sister, it would have been somebody's mother or somebody's kid or somebody's mortgage, and he had 4 tries and unlimited patience. Some nights, it does not feel that way. Some nights is where it starts. He was quiet a while, and then he said the things she had not seen coming. Can I ask you something, ma'am? Go ahead. When you sat down across from me in that equipment room, you already had it. The credential, the routing, all of it. He met her eyes. You could have walked that to the security office and had me in a cell by lunch and been the officer who caught the leak 6 days before the operation. That would have made you look right in front of every person who laughed at you. Why did you talk to me instead? Claire took her time because she wanted to answer it honestly rather than well. Because when I walked into your building, I was 90% sure you had sold us out, she said, and 10% sure you had been used. And I have lived on the wrong side of a 10% sergeant. 3 men are dead because I acted on a model I was 90% confident in and never got to check the last piece. So I do not get to skip the 10% anymore. Not for anybody, not ever, and definitely not, because skipping it would make me look good in front of people who hurt my feelings. Nolan looked at the floor for a long moment. That is the difference between you and him, he said. Kroll never checked his 10% either. He just never lost anything for it until you. Colonel Diane Prescott called in the spring. I read your full file yesterday, she said. Start to finish the way I should have done 3 years ago, instead of signing the classification and moving on to the next thing on my desk. Ma'am, I'm going to say something and I need you not to deflect it, which I understand is going to be structurally difficult for you. Prescott's voice carried a warmth Claire had never heard in it. 21 years in, I know maybe 6 officers I would trust to hold together the way you held together in Surratt. I know 2 I would trust to do what you did at Camp Halloway, and Claire, that was the harder one. Ma'am, there were other people. Whitaker, Mercer, Alvarez. There were, and every one of them moved because you moved first, and you moved first with nothing. No authority, no adrenaline, no clear enemy, 4 days of paperwork, and an entire post that thought you were a joke. A pause. Now about the 3 men. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. I want to say one thing, and then I will never raise it again unless you do. Prescott's voice steadied. You have spent 3 years asking yourself whether you were brave or whether you were just certain. I have read the after action, the imagery, the timeline, and the transcript of the stand-down order. Here is my judgment as the officer who signed your classification. You were both. You were brave and you were certain, and you were also wrong about 1 position out of 9, and all 3 of those are true at the same time. Ma'am, you have been trying for 3 years to collapse them into one clean verdict about your character, Prescott said. They do not collapse. That is not a defect in you. That is the actual price of making decisions with incomplete information. And every officer who ever mattered has paid it, and the ones who tell you otherwise are either lying or they have never been asked to decide anything. Claire could not say anything for a moment, and Prescott let her have it. There is a practical piece, too, she said eventually. The department is rebuilding the entire framework for how contractors get vetted for expanded operational access. Camp Halloway is the case file the review is built on. Whatever happens in your career from here, understand this went a great deal further than 1 corridor. The transfer orders came through in June. A joint operations planning division, Prescott's recommendation attached, and a role built around exactly the work that had gotten her laughed out of a briefing room in the spring. In the spring, Brennan stood up when she came in to sign out. He had not done that any of the other times. I read your file, he said. You authorized the release. I read all of it, and then I read it a second time, And there is one sentence in there I have not been able to put down. Which one, sir? The recovery cell's justification for the stand-down order. His mouth tightened. An analyst does not get to convert a projection into an operation. Yes, sir. That is a good rule, Lieutenant. I would have written that rule myself and I would have enforced it hard. He looked at her. And on Tuesday, I applied that exact rule to you in front of 40 people without knowing I was doing it. Two different commands, 3 years apart, applied the same correct rule to the same woman, and both of us were catastrophically wrong, and I have spent 11 days trying to work out how that is possible. I have thought about it for 3 years, sir. I do not have an answer. I do. Brennan came around the desk. The rule is fine. What is broken is that we apply it to the person instead of the work. Nobody in that recovery cell looked at your model. Nobody in my briefing room looked at your timing. In both cases, the rule got used as a reason not to look. His voice hardened. A rule that lets a man skip the looking is not a rule anymore. It is a hiding place, and I have been hiding in that one for 11 years and calling it experience. Claire felt something in her chest give slightly. There is one more thing. His tone changed. I have recommended you for commendation. Not for the operation, not for Kroll. Sir, for what happened between Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning. Brennan said it slowly. When 40 people had just laughed at you and nobody was watching, and there was no possible reward for continuing, and no one would ever have blamed you for stopping. You went back to a supply room and checked the rotation cycle a fifth time. Sir, that is just the job. Donovan, he said it almost gently. That is the only rare thing in this entire story. The warehouse, the metadata, the arrest, a dozen good officers could have done all of it when somebody pointed them at it. Going back to work after that room alone for people who would never know your name. In 31 years, I have met maybe 3 people who would have done that, and I was not one of them at your age. He put out his hand. Young officers ask about you now. Every new class, they ask what it looked like when you stood up in that room and would not back down. What do you tell them, sir? The truth. Brennan almost smiled. That you did not argue. You did not raise your voice. You had no dramatic line, and you did not slam anything on a desk. You just kept doing the work until the work got louder than the laughing, and it took 4 days, and it very nearly took too long. The send-off was smaller than the story that eventually circulated about her. A handshake from Brennan, and a hard-fast, completely unguarded hug from Alvarez that neither of them had expected to need as much as they did. You are going to be insufferable in a joint command, Alvarez said into her shoulder. Probably. Ma'am, Alvarez pulled back and her eyes were wet, and she was visibly furious about it. I have wanted to say something for 4 months. That night in the hallway when I told you to make the phone call, I thought you were protecting your pride. You were not wrong to ask. I was wrong about the reason. Alvarez shook her head. You were protecting the only thing that actually works, which is people checking each other's arithmetic. And you were willing to stand in a room and be humiliated by 40 people to keep it working. I did not understand that for a very long time. Nolan came too. He stood straighter than he had in the weeks after the warehouse. I put in for a transfer, he said. Personnel recovery, analysis side. Claire looked at him. I want to be the guy who notices the quiet person in the room, Nolan said. Instead of the guy nobody notices. That is the whole reason they picked me, ma'am. Nobody looks twice at the man who fixes radios. You already are that guy. I am not sure that is true. You told the truth to an officer who could have ended your career when lying was easier and safer and nobody would ever have known. Claire held his eyes. That is what noticing costs. You already paid it once on the worst day of your life before anybody promised you anything. Months later at the new posting, she stood in front of a room of junior officers for the first time as an instructor, and the room looked exactly the way she had known it would look. Some curious, some bored, 2 or 3 already glancing at the modest rank on her collar and running the same half-second calculation that 40 people at Camp Halloway had run in the spring. She did not open with the corridor. She did not mention the warehouse or Kroll or the fact that a general who had once laughed at her now told her story to every class that passed through his command. She did not mention the sealed file at all, and she never would, and the ones who eventually heard about it heard it from somebody else. She started the way she had always started. Put your pens down, she said, not because I am about to say something important, Because when your pens are down, I can see who is actually listening, and I want you to sit with the fact that the briefer can always see it. Think about the last briefing you sat through and what your hands were doing. A few pens came down, then more. Now open the data set on page 1. There is a mistake in it. I put it there. It is not clever, and it is not hidden, and any one of you can find it in about 6 minutes if you look. She let the silence run. 6 minutes. That is the entire lesson. One day somebody is going to stand up in a room in front of you with a number you do not want to hear. They will be junior to you. It will be inconvenient. It will cost you 6 minutes, and what you do with those 6 minutes is the only thing about your career that will ever actually matter. By the end of the session, the skepticism in that room had turned into the same grudging earned respect. She had spent an entire career building one careful conclusion at a time without ever once raising her voice to demand it. And back at Camp Holloway, Walter Brennan still told the story to every new class of officers who came through his command. Not as a story about rank or about a classified past or about the moment a sealed folder hit a general's desk. He told it as a story about the unglamorous discipline of doing careful work in a world that rewards volume over truth. And he ended it the same way every single time. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the one worth trusting. The quiet officer holding the folder nobody bothered to open may be the only person present who already knows exactly how the story ends. Claire Donovan never raised her voice, never demanded to be believed, and never once needed a room's permission to be right. 412 people came home because of it, and that is the whole measure of what real strength is.